Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for a diversity and inclusion webinar this afternoon. Before we make a start, I'm just going to allow a couple of seconds for people to join, as I know sometimes it does take a little while for people to join on Zoom. But as you can see, this session is going to be on imposter syndrome, and we have an amazing speaker here with us today, Nicola Whiting. Before we get into the introductions, I am, however, just going to run through our house rules. And if you've been to one of our webinars before, you'll be familiar with this. But just as a reminder that you will be muted throughout the webinar today, but please be best assured there'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions and everything at the end. So please do type any questions you may have using the Q&A bar, which I believe is at the bottom of your screen. There is the option to ask questions anonymously if you would like to do so. So there is that option. And similarly, if you have any further questions, please obviously send them over to the events email address, and which is events@CIISec.org, and we'll see if Nicola is able to take any further questions at the end. I feel like I'm signing you up to more at this point. If you do have any issues today, please do bring it to our attention using the email there on the screen, which is support@CIISec.org, and another colleague of mine should be able to pick up that with you. So without taking any more of your time, I'm going to skip and hand over to Nina Payne, who's hosting this session for us. Nina's one of our board members here at CIISec, and is doing some amazing work with Marsha and the rest of the team with the diversity and inclusion. So Nina, over to you to introduce us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and welcome everybody. Hello, thank you for joining us on a where I am rather muggy afternoon. So I hope everybody is feeling that they're getting a little bit of air in. But hopefully this will be a time of sort of reflection. I'm always really interested in coming to these webinars to hear about what I can learn. I think there's a lot to learn in this space. I speak to loads and loads of women, and a lot of women say to me they feel that they have got imposter syndrome, or they describe what I think is imposter syndrome. So I think although it is not absolutely limited to women, I think it's going to help so many of us here today. We have got a brilliant speaker in Nicola. I know that many of you might have actually attended Nicola's previous webinars with CIISec and know how brilliant she is. But for those of you that don't, let me just call out a few of those highlights on that slide. So the recipient of the inaugural National Cyber Citizen Award for her outstanding contribution to the world of cybersecurity and protection. And also clearly, you know, supportive of a supportive and award-winning business mentor for local and national business accelerators, and an Amazon best-selling author, and very crucially, and I know Nicola is absolutely passionate about her work with NeuroCyber UK, a real advocate of diversity in all of its forms. I know Nicola's going to talk to us a little bit later about the intersectionality between the different strands of diversity. So I think we'll all be fascinated to hear more of that. But it is wonderful to welcome Nicola. I'll get straight on to that. Nicola, welcome, over to you. And let's maximise the time that we get to hear from Nicola. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for a fantastic introduction. I really appreciate that. So just making sure I can actually click onto the next slide. Oh, which I can't. This is always, no, it's not letting me. So there you go. So you might be wondering why this topic? Well, one of the reasons that I'm quite keen to talk about this topic is it's something that affects us all, and it gets in the way of us following our vision and living our dream life and being our best selves, really. So today I want to help you in kicking imposter syndrome in its stupid face. So I can't see all of you as an audience today. So what I'd love you to do is be a bit participatory. So I'm going to ask you a question, and don't worry, nobody can see you. So you can put your hand up in your own private living rooms or space. I want to ask you a question, and it says, have you ever had the feeling of I'm in over my head and they're going to find out? Now, normally about this time, everybody looks at each other and then goes, yeah. So it could be when you've been asked to contribute to a discussion with maybe senior peers, or it could be when you've got a new job or got promoted, or maybe when you've been asked to speak publicly on an important topic. I know that I sometimes feel like that still. And essentially, what is really cool about imposter syndrome, and there is something cool about imposter syndrome, is that it's really common amongst high achievers. So if you put your hand up, yay, go us! It essentially is the fear of being unmasked, of being a fraud, and the accompanying tendency to denigrate or downgrade or diminish your own abilities or achievements. Now, that is imposter syndrome. Again, I love when it's women that have discovered these things. It was discovered, or first analysed, sorry, in 1978 by Dr. Pauline Clance and Susan A. Ims. So we've got ladies to thank for this start of the exciting work in this area. And behavioural science research, the studies so far, say that 70% of us have felt or will feel like this at some stage. What's really interesting is some work that I've done recently, which was primarily to women and neurodivergent people. It was in the high 90s that say they felt like this at some stage. So what's really interesting to me is that I feel like I'm a bit of an expert in imposter syndrome, and I'll tell you why later. But because of that, I am going to say that I'm going to show you some of my credentials. I had that lovely intro. So if you could just next slide for me, please. So this is me. I've won a few awards. I do a lot of stuff in AI and mentoring and diversity in all types. And I've spoken all over the world in cybersecurity topics and topics about AI and the future of that, and cyber arms race and all kinds of things. Primarily, I'm interested in business growth and how our human brain works, because we have an operating system, and believe it or not, it's older than Windows Vista. In fact, it's 150,000 years old, and I'll go into how that affects imposter syndrome later. And I'm really fortunate that people have seemed to appreciate my work and that they've bought my books and made me an Amazon best-selling author, and that's really lovely. If you could just flip the slide again, please. And because of all that and the work that I've done in diversity, I was recently given an MBE for my services to international trade and diversity. And that leads me to today's topic, because by any external metric, most people would say, well, you're pretty much top of your field then. You know, you've been in the top 20 women in cybersecurity in SC magazine and all that stuff. And yet I have still felt imposter syndrome and still have to deal with imposter syndrome. And actually, I've been really fortunate to be a judge in cybersecurity awards, where women that I look up to and admire and who inspire me, I've spoken to after I've just given them a massive award saying, you're the best in your field. And they have said that they also feel imposter syndrome. Sometimes maybe it should have been somebody else that won. And we've all felt like this. And what's really good, if you look at the next slide, you'll see that you are in really good company if you have felt like this. So that's Einstein. And he said he felt like a swindler. Emma Watson, Hermione Granger in Harry Potter, the face of Burberry, a model. She's been in Vogue magazine. She was the face of the United Nations feminism. And to quote her, I'll read this, she felt that she really wrestled with her success, and she felt like an imposter and felt uncomfortable about her acting. And in an article, she actually said that just before giving a key speech in the United Nations, which she aced, by the way, she felt terrified. You've also got people like Maya Angelou, a role model, a poet, a writer of books, the writer of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And she said, quoting, I've written 11 books, but each time I think, oh, they're going to find me out now. I've run a game on everybody and they're going to find me out. There are so many examples of this, including me. So my story has a happy ending. But some years ago, when ransomware was a twinkle in most people's eye, being autistic, which I am, I spotted this kind of growth of it. And so I thought I would write some articles and get together some experts and put everything down in a white paper, which I did. And it was really widely shared. And then WannaCry happened and everybody went, oh, here's a useful thing. And it was even more widely shared. And then what happened is this little organization called Microsoft contacted me and said, we're doing this thing on ransomware. Would you come over and be on a panel? And I was like, oh, wow, I made it. Microsoft have asked me to be on a panel. And I said, yes, I will. And I was so happy because I felt not only was this a really, really fantastic opportunity to speak publicly with a great organization that's highly respected, but it was on a topic that at the time I knew inside out as much as I could, and that I had really relevant information to give to people. And I was all set. And then I foolishly did one thing. I said, could you send me the bios of the other people on the panel? And one was a lady called Teresa Payton, who was the first female to ever serve as the White House Chief Information Officer and named as the most enterprising woman of the year. This is before I got any accolades at all. And the other was a guy called Stephen Wilson, who was the head of Europol Crime Centre and an amazing contributor to our industry. And yes, suddenly I felt I wasn't worthy and I ghosted Microsoft. I stopped returning their emails. And, you know, the thing happened without me. And I listened to it and it was fantastic. But what I realized was that I'd let myself down and I'd let the potential people down that I could have served. And that was a massive lesson for me. And that's why I learned to deal with imposter syndrome, because I vowed that that would never happen again. And the happy ending to that story is Microsoft recently asked me, a lady from Microsoft recently asked me to do a podcast with her on ransomware, and I did it. And that was this year. So I was really, really happy that I got another opportunity to talk with Microsoft. So what happens when 70% of us receive a compliment on our capability or capacity? What happens to you? Well, if the next slide is true, then what happens is this. Whoa, you're talking to me? Nothing to see here. That's a really common response. And I don't know whether it's a UK thing or globally, but basically you have a moment of panic. You go, is it true? You might say that somebody else did it, or we had help, or maybe we're lucky in some way to be there. Or perhaps we seek reassurance to make sure the person isn't just trying to make us feel better, and create an entirely different dialogue in your mind. And again, this happened to me early in my speaking career, where somebody would come up and go, I really enjoyed that. It touched me, it connected with me, really enjoyed this thing that you said. And I would go in my head, oh my word, I must have been really bad for them to come and try and support me and make me feel better about my speaking. So I can say with absolute confidence that I'm an imposter syndrome expert because I've done them all. And I would imagine that everybody in the audience is currently thinking, I've done a few of those, if not all of them too. So why do we do this? Well, if you look at the next slide, you will see that this is the neuroscience, that human operating system that I mentioned earlier. And we've got two key areas for engagement: making decisions and providing response. And if you've ever read a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, you'll know that this is pretty hardwired into our 150,000-year-old operating system. And actually, part of it is the fact that we are an emotional being. And part of it is kind of the way our chimp brain works. And if you think about it, chimps, being primates, which we are always looking to an alpha and going, who's the person in the room that should be doing this? Who's the dominant person? Who's the person with the most expertise? And quite often, society conditions us to think that it isn't going to be us. So there's a lot of stuff in this and behind this that I really haven't got time to go into today. But let me give you some assurance that in some ways, feeling like an imposter is kind of natural, but it isn't helpful for us as human beings and in achieving everything that we would want to achieve. So let's move on. So I love this slide. This is the favorite slide of every school person that I've ever spoken about in or with when I do talks in schools. And actually, can we go back to the previous slide? Because there's one thing that I'd like to mention before we come on to this. So there's one bit of neuroscience that I want to cover, and that is this emotional brain is more powerful and is hardwired to be more powerful because it's tied in to our survival instinct. So if a lion's coming towards you, this chimp brain, this emotional brain, wants us running from that lion, wants us running from the threat, not analysing our statistical likelihood of survival. And the thing with the chimp brain is it can't tell the difference between reality and fake. And in fact, that's why computer games work. So if you've ever played a computer game where it's on the ocean and you felt a bit seasick, that's your primate brain going, can't tell the difference. If you're somebody who suffers from fear of heights and you've been in a computer game and it's like high and you feel a bit dizzy, chimp brain can't tell the difference. We make a lot of our decisions and react to things primarily with our primate brain, chimp brain. And actually some of our biggest decisions, like who you're going to marry, what house you're going to live in, is on that gut instinct. And then the dumb decisions like which TV are we going to have? You spend ages logically poring over all the statistics and then you go for the one that looks nicest. Chimp brain decides things like, oh, I'll go into a mobile phone shop and pick a mobile phone up and you go, oh, that's heavy, must be a good one. You've just decided on the operating parameters and functionality of a mobile phone based on weight, which is how a chimp would pick a banana. So going back to the next slide again, that helps you understand why in this world where we're constantly facing other people's Instagram lives, it's harder and harder for us not to have to deal with imposter syndrome. Because in social media, in the workplace, and everywhere else, we edit ourselves to show our best selves to all the people surrounding us. So on Instagram, you might go, hey, here's my new car, here's my fabulous career, here's the lovely meal I've made. What you don't see is the wrecked kitchen, the debt that you've just got into for that car, or any of the other things. So this is why I speak in schools, actually, about imposter syndrome. And this Instagram factor, where people aren't showing their real selves, only their greatest hits, is one of those things that, as a manager, being vulnerable, being real, being authentic helps combat, because when you're real, other people are allowed to be real too. And actually, this one where you have this Instagram factor where people go, I'm fine, or it's fine. In the British language, fine is a really dangerous word. And actually, in the pandemic, where people have felt isolated, there has been a few good things come out of it. And one of the good things is people that have maybe had some mental health challenges and depression and things like that have actually said sometimes they felt a little bit better when everybody else has experienced some of the things that they experience on a day-to-day basis. So sometimes leadership is about sharing your own struggles and doing those kind of things. And we then help that primate mind understand the difference between people's outside Instagram lives and the reality that goes on instead. So next time you're in the boardroom or in that meeting and you feel like you're ill-equipped, I can guarantee you that there are other people in the room, possibly senior people, feeling exactly the same way. And that's where the ability to have those authentic conversations really helps organisations have better values, better vision, and be more successful. So we're not Mary Poppins, practically perfect in every way. And actually, one of the things that is useful to understand is that thing that I spoke about earlier, where I was in a room with women and a lot of neurodivergent people or neurotypical people, so autistics, dyslexics, dyspraxics, people of colour, different ethnicities, all kinds of people that maybe don't have so much privilege as other people have had in the past. The experience tends to be that when you've already got the 1,000 paper cuts from other people to your psyche, you know, when people kind of doubt your ability or make little comments that make you doubt your ability, then you're more likely to have imposter syndrome or have faced imposter syndrome. And that's something that's probably worth unpacking, maybe in the questions later, but definitely something that if you are in a group that would typically not have lots of privilege or face disadvantage in some way, comfort yourself that if you feel imposter syndrome, it may not just be down to you and your operating system. It may be down to those external influences that we face in society every day. So that's why it's there. That's some of the factors that lead to it. Let's go on to the next slide and talk about how to deal with it. So, another hand show in your rooms and in your space. Who would like to feel confident in their abilities all the time? Yeah. Let me know how you get on. No, seriously. I'm going to share with you 4 tips to help you manage imposter syndrome. And the first is run your own race. We are pre-programmed to compare ourselves with others. There's only one room for one silverback in the troop. So we're always on the lookout for who's the leader, but that's not always helpful. In fact, if you look at this race, which was in 2018, it was my second half marathon within the month for charity. You can see that half marathon I ran in 4 hours, 29 minutes and 26 seconds. I don't give a monkey's, using a pun. I am so happy. There's a guy just behind me, by the way, that looks in pain. I passed skinny people that had given up. I was so happy. I took my 17.5 stone, size 20 body, 13 point something miles and raised money for wounded soldiers. And I could not have been happier. Technically, it's after the cutoff time and half an hour slower than the half marathon I did the month before. But do I look as though I care? There is always somebody faster, more knowledgeable, or more successful than you. And if there isn't today, there may be tomorrow. Ask Roger Bannister in his 1 minute mile. So if you want to look at imposter syndrome, the only person that you have to beat is yourself. And even if you can't fit in time in your work-life balance, you know, to take selfies with stormtroopers, what you want to do is know that you need to run your own race. If you're not sure about that, have a look at what you were doing a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. If you could just move on to the next slide. Because when you look at what you did 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whatever, or where you started from, if where you started from is behind where you are today, you are successful. And even if it isn't, if you've made the journey in the past and you know that you can do it again, you can acknowledge that that is successful learning. It's really easy to forget the journey you've made so far. I recommend wholeheartedly, and this is something I learned from a lady that I did this for, is to start a success file. Now, whatever that looks like for you, just start it today if you haven't already got one. It might be a folder in your email that when somebody congratulates you for a job well done, you move it onto that folder, you copy it. It might be a Word document. It might be a newspaper clipping thing where you print stuff out, but start it. And the reason I say that is you will have dark days and down days. You will have days when you didn't hit your target, when your manager has just berated you or whatever. And because of negative bias in our chimp brains, it's then easy to go, I'm rubbish at this. That's the day when you open your success file. That's the day when you look at the other 100 times when that manager said you were awesome. Write down what you've accomplished in the last few years. Look at that journey. When I first wrote this imposter syndrome talk, I tried it out on a few people in our organisation, because that's my habit, because I like to practice. And there was a lady there, and she said, it's okay for me to share this, by the way. And she burst into tears around this time. And I was like, oh, and I stopped what I was doing. And obviously we had a talk, and some of the other people in the room had a talk, because we're that kind of organisation where we support each other. And it turned out that this particular lady had a disabled child. And this talk, I could get emotional, made her suddenly realise that she was an awesome freaking mother, because she'd been beating herself up for years, and I mean years, about the things that she still couldn't do to support her child. And she'd never stopped to look at the things that she felt were difficult last month, last year, she now could do without thinking, without blinking. And she never stopped to look at the journey that she'd made in supporting that child, which was quite emotional for her and me, and then everybody else in the room. So this is the power of looking back at your successes. Personally, if I ever feel I'm judging myself, I remember I'm an autistic kid from a council estate, but now I'm a successful autistic kid from a council estate. So add to that file every little bit, and just to sort of capitalize on something that was earlier. Now when people come up to me and say, that touched me, or something that you said was meaningful, or something you said changed my life, and then come up 2 years later, I love them. And I take the time to appreciate them, because what they've done is given you a huge gift. So thank the people that give you that gift, and don't say effectively to them what I used to do, which is, you must be wrong. Trust their judgment, because trust me, when somebody takes the time to say you are awesome, they normally genuinely mean it. So, whilst it's important to acknowledge your successes, I would just like to go on to the next slide, because you don't have to be a superhero to count yourself as successful. As I said earlier, we're not Mary Poppins. 100% perfection is not a viable life goal. So ditch that Instagram filter, because you need to live your own reality. And again, very common in people that have imposter syndrome or have felt imposter syndrome is that unrealistic goal of 100% perfection. But as humans, we're not built that way. You would never judge somebody else that way. So here's what that looks like. And I call this the self-perpetuating perfection cycle. Isn't that a nice tongue twister? The self-perpetuating perfection cycle. It goes like this. If I make a mistake on this, somebody's going to spot that I'm a fraud. So I better make this perfect, which means I'm going to stop all night, working endless hours to make sure this thing, whatever it might be, goes well, which it does. And somebody congratulates you. Phew, you think. It's because I work so hard, but I still feel a bit like a fraud. So I better keep working that hard and being perfect, because otherwise you'll find out I'm a fraud. So that is the self-perpetuating perfection cycle. So recognize that, because actually when people give each other permission to be human and fallible and flawed, I'm not talking about, by the way, not trying at all, as we all know, but I'm talking about the 80-20 rule. 80% of the stuff you do, or the stuff you achieve, is achieved by probably the first 20% of your effort. And then it becomes sort of gradually diminishing stuff, reward cycle. So, remove the Instagram filter, realize that you're not Mary Poppins, and basically enjoy your successes and take on new challenges. And if all else is failing to convince you here, try faking it till you're making it, because let's face it, that's what a lot of other people are doing. So there is one thing that people sometimes have asked me when I've done this presentation, and the next slide helps talk about that, because people have often said, well, if I talk about myself in successful terms, won't people think I'm a big head? Will they not all freaking hate me? And what I'd say there is people come in all different types. And think of this guy, Tony Stark. I think most people would acknowledge that Iron Man was not known for his humility. But you'd probably want him in a barbecue because he'd be a lot of fun. And you might want Cap as well, Captain America, who was known for his humility and was still an awesome superhero. But essentially, nobody said everybody has to be humble. And nobody said that you have to know everything. And you don't really expect others to completely deny every bit of success they had. It starts to become a bit of like a fake humble, or as I call it, a fumble. And everybody's got a spiky skill set, right? So some things they're going to be that we're great at, and some things there's going to be that we're not so great at. And there are some things that will never and won't ever and just aren't our cup of tea. And if we focus on our fail whales and start over focusing on them, it really affects who we believe we are and how much we can move towards our best selves. So, quickly moving on to the next slide, back to those times of greatest challenge when that imposter boogeyman is looming large. If I can do nothing else, if you're not convinced by now, here's something that I want you to think of. When all else fails, I want you to be as kind to yourself as I know you are to others. So, if you've been a manager and you're mentoring somebody and they were hesitant to claim their success for a job well done, what would you say to them? What would you say to them if you thought that they were experiencing feelings of being a fraud when you knew that they'd aced it? What would you say to them if they were feeling imposter syndrome but you knew they could actually do that job? What would you feel or say to them if you thought, well, you're not there yet, but I've seen how you grow and I know you will be there? So hopefully you've now got some tools in your toolkit and you'll be able to recognize imposter syndrome and recognize it isn't always something that comes from your internal self. Sometimes it's something that you're reacting to from the environment, and it's not always correct or fair. Be kind to yourself. I hope this has really helped. And on this last slide, one last thought. Many of the people on this call now, or many of the people that will watch this later, are women or marginalised people, and some of the folks here are guys, and you're getting to enjoy this too. Basically, I want you to have each other's backs, and when you recognise this syndrome in the future, on the next slide, please, I want you to help people with these tips. Help them not compare themselves to others. Help them acknowledge their successes. Tell them about having a success file. Show them your success file. Allow them not to be perfect. Talk about that Instagram filter. Be vulnerable to people and be kind to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. That was very inspiring. Thank you. We're going to open up to questions now. If anybody's got a question, please do pop it into the Q&A. We've got plenty of time. I can't see any there at the moment, so why don't I kick off with one? Nicola, thank you so much for the tips, basically. I think those are really ones very, very easy to remember as well, which I always like. Perfection isn't a life goal. We can almost just take that away as a mantra. But are there any, I know a lot of people, and I think, you know, it's probably revealing something about myself here to everybody, but I know a coach has said to me in the past, affirmations, Nina, you know, get up in the morning and, you know, look in that mirror and do some affirmations. In terms of sort of daily practical tips, is there anything else that you might add to that?
Yeah. So actually, I love the fact that you've brought up affirmations, because other people have brought this up as well. And you're like, your coach is going to hate me because affirmations don't work. And the reason they don't work is our brain, and apologies to CIISec, our brain has got a bullshitometer built in. And if you don't already believe what you're affirming, what will happen is you'll go, I'm thin, I'm thin, I'm thin. And your body will go, you ate a donut last night, you ate a donut last night, you ate a donut last night. Look at those thighs, they are chunky. So there was a brilliant book called Affirmations by a guy called Noah St. John. And what's different about how you phrase that is you let that computer that you have as a brain fill in the blanks and work for you rather than against you. So with affirmations, it only really works if you already believe it, which doesn't move you forward. With affirmations, you ask yourself a question in a positive frame. So for example, let's say you were going to go and speak to a large audience and you were a bit nervous. What you'd do is, if you'd ever spoken in front of people, you'd go, why am I going to be able to speak well here? How many ways could this work for me? And notice that you are framing that in very positive terms. And then your brain will go, well, because I've already delivered this, or because I practiced it, or I've done this before, or the audience is friendly, or whatever it might be. And when you start training yourself to ask yourself positive questions like, how do I know that I could positively lose weight? What you'll do is your brain is starting to fill in those blanks. And what you're also doing is pre-priming and programming your brain to respond like that. It's also a great way of removing negative bias that you may have experienced in the past. So for example, let's say you left an organization because the manager was a nightmare on Elm Street and they would always come over and hang over you. And every time they hung over you, they asked really negative questions that made you feel bad about yourself. So what you can do is you could do an affirmation when you start the new company to say, how do I know that the new manager is unlikely to be doing that to me? And what that's doing is pre-programming that this next experience is going to be different, for example, which is more likely to remove the negative bias from that experience that you've already had. So that's a really, really great question to unpack that.
Thank you, Nicola. And that really does sort of help and resonates with me as somebody who was told to do it, but just really found it fundamentally cringy.
Yeah. Affirmations, Noah St. John is a really great book, actually. I love the sort of power of neuropsychology, particularly when you do it to yourself.
Really, really helpful. Thank you. We've had just on the latter part of your answer there, and sort of dealing with sort of negativity in the workplace. And a couple of questions, one from Jasvinder and one from an anonymous participant, about how do you deal with, I think Jasvinder puts it beautifully, how do you deal with the haters? How do you deal with others, not yourself having this view, but the snide comments the anonymous attendee mentions as well?
So there are lots of ways of dealing with haters, and it really depends on your personal situation and your vulnerability at the time, I suppose. So, for example, let's say somebody comes up and they say something that, those sort of the worst case ones I hate are when somebody says something horrible and they go, oh, but it's only a joke. So there are two things you can do. You can either call somebody out, or you can go away and then try and deprogram what that might have done to you. Now, let's say somebody goes, I'm not sure that you should have done that way. I might have not done it that way. And it feels like what they're saying is you've made a mistake. What you can do is actually test it, because their intent may be good. And you could say, okay, so what would you have done instead? Because then they've actually got to do some work. Or you can say, can you explain a little what your intent behind that statement was, just so I am, listening properly. And I've never seen people run for the hills as fast as being put on the, could you just tell me what your intent was in raising that? Because sometimes they'll go, oh, I wanted to pay you a compliment. I thought that was really a nice outfit. And they've just said it in a really bad way. And sometimes they'll go, and they're less likely the next time to make that kind of comment. And it also highlights what they've said might have been inappropriate. Depending on how inappropriate it is, you may need to raise it with somebody else. There are circumstances where somebody is completely oblivious and you don't feel that you're in a position of strength to challenge that. So then use an ally, HR managers, other people that are maybe, say, a manager's peer. And sometimes it's just something that wasn't said with ill intent, and somebody's just low on energy and they've said something bad, or you can mitigate it yourself. It's really a judgment call. But what's important is that you don't let it land. So however you deal with that, don't let it land. I hope that's answered that.
Thank you, Nicola. Yes, very, very, very insightful. Thank you. And Jasvinder and anonymous attendee, I, on the rare occasion where I sort of have sometimes wondered about a person's intent, I often, just assume good intent actually, and actually just think maybe that individual hasn't expressed it perfectly, but where it is, genuinely, not in any way is absolutely clear. I sometimes also, again, just sort of take a breath and think, well, maybe that person is, having a bad day, and maybe that says more about that individual than actually it says about my performance.
Yeah, to be honest, this has happened to me. I'm autistic, and sometimes I'll unintentionally misframe something. And it's not intentional, and the intent is inevitably always good. And I really actually appreciate it if somebody says, can you just tell me what the intent was behind that? And then I can clarify, because I would much rather somebody said to me, actually, I didn't take that in the way that you meant it, so that I can correct something, than unintentionally wound somebody. And obviously, again, that is dependent on your knowledge of the person and whether you think they would have said something that upset you deliberately.
Yes, thank you, Nicola. We've got some more questions coming in. So one from Bev. Do you think the more one achieves in one's career only makes the feeling of imposter syndrome worse?
That depends. So for example, obviously I used myself in this example because that's a safe thing to do. If I'm then doing something that is new to me, my fear of failure may be higher because of successes elsewhere, and the fear that people will expect me to succeed because I've succeeded in, this is my third big career. I was the head of a jewelry guild before then, and an award-winning jewelry designer with multiple jewelry shops. So then coming back into technology and then getting to this level, it's like it. So my next career, because I'll probably have a third career. I've already kind of started planning out my third career, which will be something worthy. What if it all goes horribly wrong and a charity doesn't work, or it doesn't help the people I want to help? So there is a weight of expectation, but then I realized that's that practically perfect again. It's that thing that is driving you, and actually in some respects that isn't a bad thing. It is a little bit of an inner friend, because that little bit of fear of failure is what makes you try harder. It's just getting that balance so that it is not analysis paralysis and not fear paralysis. It's actually more of an enabler to spur you on.
Thank you, Nicola. A question on, which I think is a really, really great question. How can we calm down the chip reflex as it kicks in?
Yeah, that old, you're about to speak and imagine the audience naked. And it's like, I never want to imagine an audience naked. I'm just saying now. I think that depends on person to person. But one of the things I sometimes do, and this works for me, is I do my what's the worst that can happen exercise. And as long as I'm okay with the worst that can happen, then I've already kind of pre-planned it. Now, obviously, that depends on your own mental outcome of doing an exercise like that. For some people, I know that would not be a good plan. So it depends upon your own mental well-being. For other people, rather than doing the what's the worst that can happen and I'm okay with that exercise, it may be going to somebody you trust and saying, I'm thinking of doing this, but I'm really worried about it. And I might need some emotional or moral support if I go ahead. Would you be available to do that? Or, if it's a manager saying, would you be available to be a mentor as I stretch myself out of my comfort zone? The other thing is there's kind of like your comfort zone, your stagnation zone and your stretch zone, and then I like to call it the perturbation zone, when you're just on the boil. And it's okay to stretch. Most people will stretch and then they'll go back in their comfort zone, and then they'll stretch and go back in their comfort zone. A lot of people's careers are like that. But if you feel every day like you wake up and you're panicking and you're like in that boil zone, and I think most people have been in there at some stage, you may want to evaluate, is this the right space for me? Am I the right body in the right seat? Should I be having a conversation with somebody and letting them know how I'm feeling? Because that it's fine thing is really dangerous if you're feeling like that all the time. So, if you are feeling like that all the time, please go speak to somebody, because it will help.
Thank you, Nicola. And we've got one more question, so please do keep your questions coming in. The last one we've got on the chat at the moment is, what about Queen Bee syndrome? Being mean to women.
Queen Bee. Queen Bee syndrome. So I can say that I probably haven't really experienced this, except maybe at school, with the old school bully that needed to be that person. But I know other people have. And again, one of the things I probably say is this person, whoever this Queen Bee is, like this all the time? And it doesn't have to be a woman, incidentally, that you have the kind of alpha male syndrome, which is probably very similar. Are they like that all the time for everything? Or is it perhaps one area of expertise where they just feel so strongly about something that they are maybe less listening than they'd normally be? So I think it is situational. If you have got somebody that literally doesn't listen to anybody and anything, one of the other things that's worth looking at is, do they do it to everybody or do they do it just to you? And that sounds like a weird question to ask, but and please don't think this is gaslighting, because it could be mistaken as that, and it's genuinely not. My intent is to ask a sensible question. Sometimes people have different ways of thinking. Now, there are people that think very much on the spur of the moment, and they're great in blue sky meetings. And there are people that are very reflective thinkers, and they will go away and they will do loads of research before they turn up. Now, Queen Bee syndrome is not this, but I have seen it mistaken for this, where somebody turns up and they are very, very set in their conviction that it must go some way because they've spent 4 days researching it and they believe they've explored all the avenues. And then when people who are more on the fly people suggest one of the avenues that they've already explored, they can be very quick to cut them off and feel like they're not listening to them. And the experience from the person that is throwing ideas in the room is going to be horrible. And the person that has thought about everything is also, their experience is going to be horrible, because they're going to be thinking, why aren't you just trusting my judgment when I've done all this research? So sometimes it can be a difference in approach that hasn't been recognized or explored. And other times the person's just an a-hole. And I can't tell you which one it is without, people being in the room. But so look at the framing, look at the rest of it around there. And then if you have got a queen bee in the organization, it's probably something that you may want to raise with somebody, because they tend to be quite damaging individuals, same as sort of the chest beating alpha male type people. I think we're moving past that as a society. I hope we're moving past that as a society, but some people maybe need a bit of help to become their best selves and move past it, particularly if they've been hurt in the past, because sometimes it's a preservation practice.
Thank you, Nicola. I think that's it in terms of questions, everybody. Has anybody got any final questions? Last shout out.
I actually have one, Nina, if that's okay. Sophie here from CIISec. You mentioned, those tips are amazing, and I've been making a note myself. But I think, and I know you touched upon it earlier on, Nicola, as well, but kind of what do you think, how can you recognise the signs of this syndrome? Say for somebody in your organisation that maybe, maybe struggling, what kind of signs do you think there are that may, I'm sure it comes in very different ways, but.
Well, you mean if you think somebody else might be experiencing it?
Yes, yeah.
Ooh, that's kind of a hard one for me, to be honest, because I often don't notice, because being autistic, it is actually one of my diagnosed things that I don't recognize micro. No, that's cool. It's a great thing. I'm very open about the challenges that I have, because by being open about the challenges I have, I can build a network of people around me that recognize it for me, which is how a great business operates. You balance each other's strengths and weaknesses or challenge areas. Typically, if somebody is experiencing imposter syndrome, they will tend to make self-denigrating comments, because what they're trying to do is almost pre-prime it. Well, if I don't do well, you're not going to be disappointed if I say I'm rubbish at this. So there's a difference between somebody going, oh yeah, I'm rubbish at this, but I'll give it a go, and you know that they're going to ace it because they always do, and somebody that's like, I'm a bit worried, I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to do this well for you, and I may not recognize that all the time, but even I recognize it sometimes, but other people are more able to recognize it. It also depends on the person that's saying it to you, because sometimes people say that all the time, and other times, they're normally confident people, and this is atypical behavior. So it is kind of hard. I'm a very direct person and a very frank person. So if I'm thinking somebody might be feeling this, then I tend to raise it with them and say, you just said you're not sure about this. Normally I'd think you'd ace it. Are you feeling a bit vulnerable around this project? Is there other stuff that's going on that's making you feel like that, or why, but it does depend whether they're up for that conversation or not. And I normally precede that by the way, if I've misread this, please just tell me to stuff off. That works quite well. Yeah, so
Thank you.
I don't know. Did that help?
Yeah, it really did. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Well, we've got 4 minutes left, everybody. I'll ask one more, if I may, and then perhaps we'll close the session. My question is a practical one, please, Nicola. I sit as a sort of interviewer a lot, and I sit with various other interviewers, and quite often a question that the panel puts out to the interviewee is, what are your development areas? So I think that's a really interesting question in terms of
Yeah, that question, by the way, does not fool anybody. Everybody reads that question as, what do I suck at?
Yeah.
You can call it developmental areas, you can call it, what are your areas of growth, your growth areas? Like, basically it's, tell me, what do you suck at? And this is exactly one of those things that I was raising earlier about the intersectionality of neurodivergent, neuroatypical people. Because typically, if you ask an autistic person, for example, what do you suck at? They'll be brutally honest and they'll go, well, I'm really bad at this and I'm really bad at this and I don't recognize micro expressions and I might need somebody to help me out with this one. And the people in the interview will go, whoa, this person sounds like they need a lot of work and support. Whereas other people that recognize this is the game of interviews will do Instagram. Because this is exactly where you get that Instagram picture out, and they'll go, well, you know, sometimes I push myself too hard and to overachieve. Nobody is going to see that as a weakness. Everybody has practiced for interviews. How can I say something positive about myself while framing it as a challenge area? Because people want the job. So, yeah, so I know very few people that will be that candid in a scenario where you're competing with people. It's literally the perfect Instagram setup. A better place to ask it is after somebody's got the job, because then they're more likely to be honest. And the best framing that I've ever found is, we want you to be successful and thrive. What things do we need to do or support you in to enable you to thrive and be successful in the quickest way possible? Because then you can go, look, instead of saying what are your challenge areas, like what areas do you want to grow in, because we want you to thrive, we want you to do well, and now's your opportunity to have that support right from the get-go. So, you know, here's a big grown-up conversation, but it's when they're feeling a lot safer. And if it's framed in a, this is what we always do for everybody, we talk about your preferences for working, we talk about how you like to absorb information, we talk about how you like to interact with people, we talk about maybe what areas of challenge have you had in other places that we can know about now so that we can mitigate it so you don't have them here. That's a positively framed, productive way of having that conversation. It's unlikely that someone's going to have that in an interview because you're going to get their Instagram self.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Nicola. I think that's really useful for both interviewers and interviewees to get that answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We are on the hour, everybody. So thank you so much, Nicola, for spending more of your time with CIISec, for giving us some very, very practical tips that we can all take away and start putting into practice and seeing how we go. We'd be really interested as CIISec to hear how you guys get on. Please do let us have some feedback as to how you have implemented these in your day-to-day lives. If you've got any other views, please don't hesitate to pass them through to CIISec in terms of feedback on how we can improve the sessions. We're always looking to continuously improve. But thank you very much, Nicola, for your time today.
My absolute pleasure. I was also going to say that I wrote an article for Forbes on imposter syndrome, which I think you're going to share afterwards and expands on some of these things. So if people don't always take information in verbally, most of the things I've said kind of went into that Forbes article. So hopefully that will help folks too.
Absolutely, and it's a really good article, everybody, so really recommend that. But thank you again, Nicola, and I hope to see everybody at the next session. Sophie, yeah, there we go. Thank you, Sophie. The telepathy is working, Sophie, thank you. So please do come and join us for the next session, and thank you so much again, Nicola, and take care, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks.